Good morning or good evening. I'm all turned around right now. Looks like my lights are a little bit off too. Give me a little spot in the head there. I kind of find that a little bit bothersome that it picks up my nice, bright, shiny head and then it tries to reflect light off of it from that. So I'm going to have to write a complaint about this. So very glad to have everybody here tonight. And I'm really proud you guys got all those questions answered. Those are some ones that stumped me once. I know that I had a boss once who used to say, just like the Bible says, this too shall pass. And I just kind of took her word for it till I looked it up and found it wasn't. I always thought the spirit is willing and the flesh is weak. I remember thinking that was something Paul had said. And then when I couldn't find where Paul had said it, I decided it must not have been there. And then, of course, I found Jesus saying that in the garden. So kind of an interesting way of understanding passages. It's good that I'm so proud everybody does very well in these questions. Maybe you're sometimes, though, those people that say, boy, I didn't know any of those and I'm not sure. Years ago, we played a Bible trivia game, or and I applaud these kind of games because they kind of help us to get a better sense of scriptures and the things we're reading. It's good to test ourselves like this. But we did a game once called, was it in the Bible or was it in Star Trek? And it was tough. There's just a lot of names in the Bible that I don't always remember, and and some of them are pretty odd sounding names. So it's good to test ourselves, and there's always an opportunity to learn a little bit more. So sometimes if you feel like you're not up to the game, you will be. We're always working on those things together. So appreciate you guys participating in that with me and help me out too. Let's get our Bibles. Let's go over to 1 Timothy chapter 3. So 1 Timothy chapter 3, we've been talking about the qualification of elders. And let's be honest, this is something of some, well, not controversy, but sometimes it could be a bit of something that's in a debate about the characteristics of the work of overseers. Probably all of us are aware of how denominations make a mess of this, and they mix the pastor up with the preacher, and sometimes they see pastors as different than elders, and they just really make a mess of it. They don't even consider qualifications when they look at these things. But sometimes even among our own brethren, some people look at the qualifications very loosely. Other times we're pretty tight about it, how we look at the qualifications, and it's kind of an important idea. Somebody was recently sharing with me their thought that we ought to be thinking of these things as characteristics too. I've heard lots of great lessons on this. I wish I could share all the thoughts with you about those things, but what we're really trying to understand though is how, first of all, these are things that are characteristics of those that oversee the church, but secondly, how important it is that all of us are pursuing these things. These are the things that all of us are striving to have and to make our own virtues and characteristics. So it's just important stuff that we're talking about. And tonight we're getting into one of the areas about the qualifications of overseers that does sometimes have some controversy as we talk about the qualifications around the family of the overseer. Get your Bibles out. We're going over to 1 Timothy chapter 3. And we're looking here in 1 Timothy chapter 3, right after verse 3. We had finished last time the language of being covetous. Now, by the way, let me show you something here real quickly by bringing up a second version of the Bible. It's kind of interesting that, like the New American Standard and the New King James, which are both really good translations, they kind of reverse the wording of that last qualification, covetousness, love of money, and it's because there's two different terms that are used that are very similar about those things. I know somebody had asked me about that later, and I just wanted to clarify that idea with you. But last time we had finished talking about the characteristic of being covetous here. But the next point I want us to think about is verses 4 and 5. When it speaks about the overseer as one who rules his own house well, having his children in submission with all reverence. For if a man does not know how to rule his own house, how will he take care of the church of God? Now, what I think is really interesting here is that this is the first time in these qualifications where we get this is why that qualification is there. In other words, he's kind of telling us, Paul is saying this qualification is there because, and maybe you get it right away too, right? And I'd love to hear your thoughts on this one because I think this one's kind of important. I'm going to adjust my camera just a little bit. Maybe I am, maybe I'm not. Maybe I'm just going to make my picture worse. But this is one of those very interesting statements about the characteristic of why it is that the elder has to have, and it doesn't use the term here, but it talks about in Titus the necessity of having faithful children. And of course, that term itself is one of some complexity for us to consider here. But the point is, Paul is tying the concept of how a man oversees his home is kind of a reflection of how it is that he oversees the local church. Now, I want to be careful to say it's not like he's saying, well, the church are your children, but it is somebody that you're responsible for if you're overseeing that local church. There in Hebrews chapter 13, it says that the overseer has to give an accounting for your soul. So in that sense, he bears that responsibility. But the idea is if a man is not able to oversee his home, then he won't be able to oversee the church of God. And that's pretty well stated right here. Anybody has a thought on that? Like I said, I'd love to hear it. I'd love to hear what you're thinking about these things. So let's kind of dig in here in what it says in verse 4 when it talks about one who rules his own house well. Let me grab for you the slide I have on this. And the terminology here is the idea of what it is. Now, Stephen Root brings up something interesting. He says, rules the household with respect and not fear. Now, Stephen, that's actually specific to the language here if you look at this word. So the Greek word that's translated to rule is the term prostomai, which means to stand before or to stand in front of. And so, Stephen, it's very interesting you kind of make that statement of the idea of ruling with respect versus fear, because the idea is this is somebody who stands in front of everybody for them to see the conduct that they're supposed to have. Kind of interesting, by the way, in Titus chapter, Titus chapter 2, the Apostle Paul tells Titus, who is the evangelist, he says, you need to stand as an example of the good works that you're teaching. So it's kind of interesting that, can I be fair to say all of us need to stand this way? We all need to be an example of the things we want others to understand. Well, the point is here, he's trying to describe the idea as the overseer is somebody who stands up in front of his family, and his family's able, and I'm thinking more, of course, of his children, but, in this terminology, but the idea is that he stands in front of them, and they can look to him as an example of righteous conduct, of righteous behavior. We could talk a lot about this one because I just think it's such an important idea. We could go a couple of directions. We could talk about how important it is to be a father that is respected. And remember, it's not that the idea that you compel people to respect you. They respect you because of the quality and characteristics of your leadership. That's the language that we're talking about here. And the idea is that whenever we consider the people that oversee the congregation, they're supposed to be people that we can see that in their family, they are respected as having been examples of godly conduct. Stan's got a couple of comments here. Stan says, someone who can show leadership in his home. That's good, Stan. That's really the idea that grabs it here. Stan goes on to say, some have said that when you look at a person's children, you see what that man is. And Stan, that's important. I realize there's exceptions to that rule, and sometimes there's a lot of exceptions to that rule. But truth be told, there's something generically or generally true about that. That reflects on the kind of person they are. Because remember our preacher is always saying baseball dads have baseball sons. And he says that to imply the idea that our children tend to pick up our characteristics, our interests, our pursuits, whether we're trying to teach them to or not. So that's an important point. Teresa goes on to make this statement. Teresa says, if a man does not have respect from his children, perhaps he's not taken on the responsibility for his children's well-being, just as an elder must for the congregation. Now, Teresa, let's play with this idea for a second about the important idea of, the absence of respect because of the absence of responsibility. Whenever somebody selects an overseer, we're not selecting a stranger. It's not as though we're going out and saying, we're just going to find somebody. This is somebody that we're supposed to already know. And Teresa, your comment makes me think of the idea that this really is somebody that we're already supposed to have some respect for, that we should already say, this is somebody who does take responsibility for events in our congregation, for things that are happening. This is somebody who is worth my respect. I'll be careful how I say this, but if it were the case where somebody was going to be an overseer, but they weren't really respected by members of the church, maybe there's a problem. Maybe there's something that ought to be considered in that. And I really think there's something in what you're saying, Teresa, that really is a pretty important idea. I appreciate that comment. Lamar says this. Lamar says, taken with the other qualifications listed, ruling their house well would include all aspects of presiding over the family, the money, hospitality, neighbor relations, fair to all, faithful kids. Great point. It's kind of interesting. You think about that, Lamar. I kind of like what you're saying because you're really talking about the idea of being a good manager, right? I know you don't mean it in a business sense, but let's almost think of it like a business sense. If your family's a business and the goal of your business is to turn out successful Christians, that's what a family business ought to be about, right? The goal of the family business is to turn out faithful disciples. That's, we could talk about the church being like that too, but that really is the godly family goal, to turn out successful disciples. And, that goal should wrap itself around a lot of different characteristics. So it's really an important idea to think about here, the idea of how they preside over the things they have. And what's neat about what you said there, Lamar, is, we talk about the money, and he's talked several times about being free from the love of money, hospitality, neighbor relations. We haven't got to this yet, but in verse 7, he's going to talk about that. So Lamar, I believe that's probably exactly what your point was. And it really is kind of neat. To say you're picking somebody who's already managed a little church. He's already overseen a little church. That is to say, his family. So it's an important thing. And Lamar, I really like the way you kind of took that, because that really does kind of give us a good sense of how these things are. Stan's got a comment here I want to grab. Stan says, when a man whose children does not show that they have followed the example of being a Christian, the idea here is that if they haven't had the example, perhaps, then they've not followed these things. There is kind of a tricky area in some of these thoughts too. I remember years ago, I knew a brother who was just a very godly man, but what was kind of interesting was he hadn't become a Christian till later in life. And even though he had children that were Christians, I always thought what was interesting was that was really his wife's accomplishment more than his, that she had been a diligent and godly mother, and she had given a good example, and her children had become faithful because of that. But his faithfulness was a little bit later on. I struggle with how that fits to this circumstance, because technically he's qualified, but at the same time, I wonder if the purpose of the qualification fits in there well. And I'm not saying whether he was or wasn't an elder, but it just more was something that I wondered about and thought about. It kind of is a tricky thing. And there's a lot of tricky things about how we consider some of the qualifications or some of these characteristics for the children of the overseer. Stan's next comment, he says, when we look at those children who have left home and then have turned away from God, who knows what the father may or may not have done to keep his children in the faith, And Stan, one thing I will say is this. It doesn't always mean that the father failed or the mother failed. Children, we all have our own will. We all have our own ability to make decisions. I want to be careful to say that everybody, just because someone's child falls away, it doesn't necessarily mean that they, and somehow fail to instill the proper values. But at the same time, the point is, if they succeeded, the implication is that they did install those values. And that's kind of an important point. And maybe Stan, it's even worth kind of an aside on this to say, when we look at somebody who may not be qualified to be an overseer, we're not really saying that somehow they failed. We're just saying that that's not the work that God has for them to do. Now, I think all of us look at these different works here and we understand that there's a lot of reasons most of us aren't qualified. Maybe we're not a man. Maybe we don't have grown children. Maybe there's a lot of circumstances there. It doesn't mean we're not faithful to God. It doesn't mean we're not useful to the church. I really emphasize this idea that, for many of those, they're fulfilling what could be said to be the more important work of the church, such as teacher or, those who edify and uplift the congregation. So it's important for us to understand that if somebody doesn't meet these criteria, it doesn't necessarily speak to the idea that they have somehow failed to stand up. But it is, as you say, Stan, it is interesting because you can kind of see how this does testify to that they at least did that important point. Here's Lamar's got another comment. Lamar says, also worth noting that in the early church, most times they would meet at the house for worship and other activities so that they would be able to observe the elder ruling in many situations that we may not. Now, Lamar, you say something important here. Let's sit on this for a moment. And by the way, the concept of where exactly they met, we know they met in upper rooms, rented buildings, schools. In fact, a lot of times they were in, buildings as much as anywhere. But more importantly, with the important working of hospitality, they were in each other's homes. And so there's supposed to be an observation, a time to see these characteristics in play. And I think it would be very important for somebody to say, how does a man lead his wife? Does he lead her by an example? Does he lead her by, respecting her? And, think of 1 Peter chapter 3, where he talks about, giving your wife an honor that renders like the delicate vessel. Does he treat his wife in that sense? Does he, would you, if you were one of his children, respect him the way he treats you or the way he speaks to you? Those are all important ideas, things that you might consider in these characteristics. And Lamar's right to say these are things that when we're in each other's lives, they should be easy for us to find. So that's a really good point, Lamar, and I really appreciate that observation. Teresa says this: if a grown child falls away, I'm about to sneeze and it keeps coming and going, so I may have to stop here in a second. I apologize for that. Teresa says, if a grown child falls away, okay, I think I've got it under control. If a grown child falls away, the man, parents, should be working with them to teach and bring them back into the church, wherever that child now lives. It's and that's a tough one, Teresa, too, because, it's the kind of thing that I often tie the parable of the prodigal son and that father's, work or his affection for, that lost son of his, that he should come back. There are ways we reach out and there are ways we don't reach out, right? I guess we all could agree on that there are ways that we reach out to those who have fallen away and encourage them to come back, and there are ways we don't reach out to them. The Bible gives us some parameters for those things, and I've always said that the example of the prodigal son and his father's relationship might serve us well to consider in those things. So, important point, and I think one of the things to think about is that that's then true for the overseers in the local church, and let's put a point on this. Let's chase this rabbit for just about a minute or two and say this: the overseers, everybody in the church, ought to have a care for those who have fallen away. It ought to be something that we're all mindful of, and that we have a desire to see that they're restored. Because I said earlier that the overseers are responsible; they're going to have to give an accounting for that. But can you understand the idea that all of us have to give an accounting for that? That everybody in the local church will have to give an accounting for that? It's not just the elders that are going to be held responsible for that, although the elders will be held responsible for that. Can we understand, would it make sense to everybody that we're all accountable to be reaching out and trying to encourage those who have fallen to do what we can? According to the scriptures, according to the things we're told to do, to try to encourage people. All of us are responsible to do this. It's a great point for us to consider for a moment. I always hesitate to use the terminology to shun someone who's fallen away, only because shun means I don't say anything to them. But I tell you what, if I see somebody who's lost, I want to tell them I miss them and I want them back, and they need to know that. And I think it's an important point for us to consider for a moment, that all of us are going to give an accounting for those who have fallen away. We need to be mindful of that. We need to be thoughtful of that. That's why whenever somebody's falling, whether it's the overseers in the church or the members of the church, we'll often say, hey, this brother, this sister is in trouble. Call them, reach out to them, try to get a hold of them. Do what you can to encourage them not to lose so great a salvation. So Teresa, I appreciate that you gave us a little bit of a plug for us to kind of be mindful of, and I'm grateful for that statement. So as we consider this idea that the overseer is somebody who in his home, he stands up before his family, an important point for us to consider here is that in the idea of standing up, it gives us also a sense that this is so his children are in submission with all reverence. Now, I guess maybe one of my thoughts is, I know sometimes we try to consider or understand this idea of children in submission. And some of the context of that. Sometimes people say, well, I think this probably just refers to children living in the home. And I certainly think it does consider that, but I'm not sure that I would say there's anything about the language or the context that means it's exclusively about our children in the home. In other words, that the idea of children in submission, and I want to be careful to say that what is submission between adults? That's maybe the thing you need to consider here for a moment. We're supposed to, Ephesians chapter 5, verse 18, submit to one another. I'm thinking the right passage. Maybe it's Colossians chapter 3 I'm thinking of, Colossians 3:15. But the point is, submit to one another, that we're all supposed to submit to one another as mature people. So if it is talking about the idea of grown children and such, we need to get a good sense of what it means that they submit. And part of that might be the idea that they are willing to submit. And it doesn't necessarily say it's about submission to, the father or the parents. It might just be the idea that they have the characteristics of submission. There's language as we jump over to the book of Titus that talks about that they're not reported to be, their behavior is not rebellious in general, that we might consider those things as well. Here, Stan's got a comment. He says, just as a father may feel like a failure if one of his children fall away, an elder is in sorrow about those who have fallen away. Stan, thank you for saying that. That is an important thing to consider. Good overseers feel the same sorrow and the same sickness of heart whenever somebody falls away that somebody whose child falls away feels. That's an important point to consider. It's personal, it hurts, it should be. It should feel all of those things. And Stan, I appreciate you saying that, because let's both understand that we all should have some of that, but particularly I want to be careful here, but I know that sometimes there are men who work and oversee churches, and it's almost as though that if somebody's weak, they're almost glad to see them leave the church, because then they think, well, we don't have to deal with that anymore. I've seen it. Maybe you've seen it too. And that's a terrible thing. Stan's point is fantastic. We ought to all consider the sense that we lose a member. It should hurt all of us. But the overseers ought to feel the same sense of sorrow that a parent might feel in those circumstances. I really appreciate that, Stan. That's a great comment. Teresa says Jesus condemned the Jewish leaders for being so precise in their giving to the temple and neglecting their parents. That's a great point. Teresa, that was the very passage, Matthew chapter 16. It was the very passage I was thinking about, where Jesus said, you're supposed to honor your father and mother. And what's neat about that passage, Teresa, is that he wasn't talking to children. He was talking to adults. The obligation of grown children, of adult children, that they still have an obligation to honor their father and mother. And Jesus elaborates on what that was. And just like you say, those people, the Jewish leaders, were forsaking that commandment. Teresa goes on to say, we honor our parents for their entire lives. Teresa, I might even suggest even beyond that point, I don't know with Paul when he was writing to Timothy was, when he told Timothy, your faith was first in your grandmother and then in your mother. I don't know if either of them were living or not, but he's calling on him to honor that faith. So that's kind of a neat point to consider, that even past that point, there's a sense of honoring them by taking those characteristics that are worthy of repetition and emulating those things. So Stephen Wood gives an interesting comment here. Stephen says submission could be the ability to hear what the other has to say with the word in mind. That's really interesting, Stephen. I kind of knocked things off there for a second. Stephen, that's a really interesting observation. I really like that idea. The idea that submission is perhaps trying to understand what somebody's telling you. Stephen, that would be a great thing to talk about if I were teaching about being a good father or a good parent, is the idea of trying to understand what your children are telling you and trying to see what it is that they are communicating, particularly when there's friction or when there's, a problem. I think one of the terrible things is that if we are concerned that submission isn't being fulfilled, what we do is we turn on a heart or a mind of, I will compel you by force or by whatever means I have in my ability to force you to submit, versus that sense of I'm going to manifest that desire for you to submit by understanding. I think it's important. And again, I think particularly with overseers, how does somebody bring about a submission in somebody else when they're not children, they're not juveniles, they're not somebody you can just say, if you don't shape up, I'm going to ground you. Instead, it comes about by trying to have an understanding and trying to develop respect. Certainly, sometimes people just won't have it, but sometimes it's something that we can develop by, just as you said there, Stephen, by trying to consider what others have to say. Oh, Lisa gave me my passage. That's the one I wanted, Lisa. Ephesians 5:21. I was off. Lisa, you get tonight's stump the chump point. You corrected me. I was in the wrong verse there. It's verse 21 that we wanted. Submitting to one another in the fear of God. That's the passage I was trying to get a sense of. What's it like when adults submit? Here you have a couple of Greek words. I haven't even mentioned those, by the way. In submission or under control. The terminology here, their child, daughter or son. I realize one of the matters of contention could be whether or not it implies that you have more than one child or not. It does use a word for plural children here, but of course we're also talking about a plurality of elders. So it's not exactly taken that it must necessarily mean that they have to have more than one child. In fact, if you go on a little further on, it says, verse 12, deacons are ruling their children and their own house as well. Well, I think all of us would understand that even though it speaks of children, it doesn't mean that a deacon has to have more than one house. Otherwise, a couple of our deacons could be in trouble. I think both of them just had the one house. So it's something you might consider there, that the idea of, what are we speaking to, maybe isn't that specific. However, on the converse of that, we could say, though, that there is a sense where multiple children might help to establish more thoroughly the success of that person in standing before his family. So, I could see why it might be the idea of multiple children. That's just an interesting matter to discuss and to think about, what it is pointing to here. As I said, certainly the text does make use of that term children, but at the same time, the language doesn't really give us a specificity one way or the other. It's kind of hard for us sometimes to consider in that point. Let me grab a couple other comments here. Lisa Root says, Colossians 3 and verse 20 says, obey your parents in all things. Now, in that one, Lisa, that's kind of interesting because I do wonder if that speaks more to those who are in the home. I mean, Lisa, could you imagine if it doesn't? It would be a very unusual command to say, obey your parents in all things. Now, like I said, if it doesn't mean your younger children, then that's the command. We don't really debate the commands of God. It's just whether or not that's exactly what it means is kind of a puzzle to me. Is it talking about children who might be adults, or is it potentially talking about those who are still in the home? I've always wondered about the Colossians 3 statement and what it is talking about there, so I appreciate that. One more comment here. Teresa makes the statement, she says, submission is to yield or surrender willingly. Teresa goes on to say it is a choice, and that's an important point to consider. I like to say submission is a gift that we give to one another. We submit to one another. We're giving each other this sense of not my way, your way. And I love to use the term that submission is a gift that we're giving to one another. Now, in this language here, I feel like we really need to go ahead and touch over to the statement in Titus chapter 1 and verse 6, which parallels this, because I imagine some of you are kind of looking for it here, and it is just something we need to address, even though, as I said, sometimes it becomes a matter of some contention. I do think it's important for us to consider this for a moment, and that is the fact that in Titus chapter 1, when he has the parallel passage, he says, having faithful children not accused of dissipation or insubordination. This statement here about having faithful children not accused of dissipation or insubordination is the parallel to what we were reading there. And the key passage here that kind of helps us to see a sense here is the concept of faithful children. Now, there's a couple of ways that people look at this passage. Number one, there are some that say that faithful here could apply to a lot of different terminology. It could be the idea of faithful as in they're respectful to their parents, they obey their parents, versus faithful to the Lord. Now, I've done a lot of Greek studying on this, and I'm not a Greek scholar, so I have to confess that right away, but I've read a lot of writings of people that are, and in the end, there's just nothing in the word itself that helps us to answer that. That in other words, the word itself could imply either that it's about faithful children, faithful to God, or faithful to the parent. However, I'd suggest to you that the context leads us to conclude that it must be the idea that they're faithful to God. And you might kind of see why we would draw that conclusion, because the context is you're supposed to, having accomplished this work of overseeing your family and having successfully brought them, that you're supposed to now translate that to the local church. So that in other words, it would only really make sense that we're not looking in the local church for people to obey every whim of the elder and whatever he says. Instead, what we're trying to do is get people to heaven. So it would make the most sense to say that one of the overseer's important qualifications is that he has successfully done that. He has fostered children that have come to know God and are faithful to God. And I think that would really be the appropriate context of this passage. And as I said, I realize that some people might have some different thinking on that, but I would suggest that the context really only gives us one clear direction in this. And that context gives us the direction that what we're accomplishing here is getting people successfully to be disciples. I got some comments here I'm going to grab here. So Stan says the following. He says, it's interesting that we say there must be multiple elders. Stan, I think you mean by this, not that we say this, but the Bible indicates there are multiple elders. That's right. And Stan goes on to say, it seems as one man should shepherd the flock, that it would be that if a man only has one child does not show how well a man can control his family. So Stan, maybe I did miss your point there a little bit, but the idea of the multiple elders, and I think maybe this is what you're saying, Stan, that's not something we say. That's simply the pattern of the New Testament. We see that every congregation had multiple shepherds. We can kind of see the wisdom of that, although we obey that not because of our understanding of the wisdom of it, but because it's the example given to us. But as we see this, the idea that, somebody is shepherding, they're doing this work. Now, Stan goes on to say, and I think it's a different thought, it would be that a man only has one child does not show how well a man controls his family. And Stan, I think that's a good point. I think the idea is we're supposed to be demonstrating this, and I kind of mentioned this before, that while it's not language-wise, it doesn't really give us any sense of that, we can have some sense of that ability to accomplish that task by that sense of more than one child. So there's certainly that point as well. So really, like I said, I think I might agree with you, Stan, that in some ways that would be the characteristic we can help a little bit better. So Lisa makes this statement. Lisa says, Lisa says, if they are faithful to their parents, then that, in my thoughts, would mean that they are faithful to God. Hey, Lisa, that's a good comment. Especially if godly parents are fulfilling their purpose, which is to generate disciples. So, Lisa, I think your comment really fits nicely. That, ultimately, and, I'm going to talk to my kids like this, that if they don't accept God, they're not accepting me because, I'm going to do my very best in my life to be one with God. So, you can't have one without the other would be my hope in life. So, Lisa, I think that's a great comment. Stan says a variety of members, like several children under control. So Stan is kind of contrasting the idea of multiple children with multiple members in a church. I can see that. Teresa brings up the idea that different translations use the term to children that believe. And like I said, the idea here is the Greek word is pisteos, and pisteos we usually use for terms like believing and having faith. And again, I think contextually that's what it means. But it also is used sometimes for the idea of being, obedient and being, in submission in that sense too. So it's kind of tough. But I think a lot of translators took the position that they had to be believers because contextually, I think that was the best fit to the passage. So Teresa, I appreciate that comment. Teresa goes on to say, not accused of right or unruly. And again, I would take that back to the idea that, that he says a little bit earlier that his children need to be in submission with reverence. The word for reverence is the idea of, a proper conduct and behavior. And that's, a really good point. So Stan goes on to say, I know a man who has 4 children, one of them an elder, and 2 of them deacons. One child attends a denomination, not qualified to be an elder. And that, like I said, that I would agree. I would say that probably is the case as well. That without faithful children, it's simply not a calling. It doesn't diminish his character. It doesn't diminish anybody's character in any way, and the other purposes that he's called for. But I don't want to go into too much speculation, but you could kind of see how if somebody doesn't have a faithful child, that renders them with a weakness that others could even exploit to say, well, look at your child over here in that sense as well. So again, it would seem that would be the case, the best way to interpret that. But I understand, like I said, sometimes people see these things a little bit differently. And I often say that, in seeing these things differently, at least we have a path that we're certain would be pleasing to God. And sometimes whenever we're not entirely sure which way to go, that's the path we have to choose. The path that we know would accomplish the purpose of God. And I think sometimes, and it may be the case that some qualified people ended up not doing a work that they could have done because we overestimated. But I don't see that we're going to have a great deal of problem with that, as opposed to those who maybe weren't supposed to have taken a work and we thought they should. I hope that kind of makes sense. And what is, as I said, very agreeably, can easily be a difficult position or a difficult thing to see. And that's okay. It's all right that, we struggle all to understand this the same way, because a lot of times what we're looking at are some very difficult situations. As we pick up, we got another point to pick up here at verse 6, where he says, not a novice, lest being puffed up with pride, he fall in the same condemnation as the devil. Now, this is interesting because, yet again, he gives us this characteristic and explains why the characteristic is what it is. Now, let me test you on this one for a second. So in Acts chapter 14, when Paul is going through the churches of Galatia, he appoints elders in every church. Yet in those congregations, there's a circumstance where these people, none of them had been Christians more than probably a year at the most. So they're appointing men as elders that had not been Christians for quite a year. How do you reconcile that statement to this statement here about being a novice or being somebody who's a new convert? Because I would say, a year is probably a pretty new convert. Anybody have a thought about that? I tell you what, while we're kind of talking around these things, I'd love to hear what you have to say. By the way, sometimes we wonder about, well, is there a specific age that a man is that he's considered an elder? Elder just means older man. And that's a tough one too. I will tell you though, we can do a little bit of math in the New Testament, and we can find a good guesstimate for the age of James, who was one of the elders in the church in Jerusalem. And the way we can do that is we roughly know how old Jesus was when he died, and we can put James's age as being Jesus's younger brother as just a year or 2 years or 3 years younger than that. We can add then the time from Jesus's death and burial and resurrection to his ascension, to the events that are recorded in Acts chapter 15, or more specifically, the statement made in Galatians chapter 2 about when Paul goes to Jerusalem. And we add about 14 years to that. So we get a sense that James, the elder in the church of Jerusalem, was probably in his mid-40s. Now we're going to be careful to say that's putting together a lot of information, and it doesn't necessarily mean that necessarily that's the point somebody's qualified. The Bible doesn't specify what an older man is. I think it's just something we have a sense of. Let me kind of go back to the question that I asked though. The question was, how is it that Paul could appoint elders in these churches when they'd only been a convert for about a year? Got a couple of really good answers here. And I think both answers are really the same thing. So Stan makes the point to say these men may have been educated in the law of Moses. And then Gregor says, well, they brought his whole family, maybe was a Jew, well respected in the community. I think you guys are right. I think that's our answer. That in other words, they weren't novices in the things of God. They were men who had probably lived their lives walking according to the law of Moses. And so we wouldn't really say they were novice because they would have been people that were already doing these things. In fact, Lamar makes a comment here that kind of says it nicely. Lamar says the qualifications would be the same for them, and their meeting the qualifications would have been evident to those who knew him and worshiped with him. So what's neat about what Lamar says is that the qualifications of overseers, they would have been fulfilling perhaps in their pursuit of the things of the law of Moses. And that's a great comment, Lamar. I appreciate that. Debbie kind of shares this. She says, well, they had a knowledge of the old law which taught about Christ and his church. And again, they had been walking in it. They had the discipline of these things. That situation doesn't exist today. That situation only existed in the first century. That's why the gospel, that's why the gospel message in the first century, under what we call the Great Commission, was to the Jew first, and then to the Gentile, because of that unique situation. But the point is that those circumstances wouldn't exist today. One more point. Lamar says, just a thought that the Galatians example may have a different view on the believing children question just discussed. That's interesting, Lamar. Kind of an interesting point to consider. You wonder what that would imply about that. At the same time, I almost wonder if what Lisa said earlier might kind of bring that back to it, that a man who was respected by his family, they would have pursued the things he pursued too. It's an interesting question. It does make you wonder about how some of these things were worked out. But the point maybe we want to focus back in on here is that there's a danger if someone is too new to these things, or the term neophyte means a novice, somebody who's brand new to something. That the point was, don't bring in somebody who's not experienced and committed. He goes on to say, because they're going to fall into reproach, or they're going to fall into the same condemnation of pride as the devil. By the way, let me just kind of make a plug here to say, I think that this probably is the problem for a lot of the denominational issues that they have with their version of the pastor system. That, in other words, they appoint pastors that are young and that are, maybe pretty new to things. And I think that there is a great danger of pride and a great danger of of error. I'm not sure necessarily that they're saying that the pride, the condemnation of Satan, that Satan's condemnation from the beginning too was being leading others into sin, and that might be the case as well. Teresa makes the statement that they had Paul's letters and prophecies. They had spiritual gifts. Now, Teresa, that's the second thing a lot of people have pointed out, that perhaps that issue of being a novice was nullified because of spiritual gifts, like supernatural wisdom and supernatural knowledge. Those are two gifts that are mentioned in 1 Corinthians chapter 12. So that's a good point. That might be what also solves some of this dilemma for us to consider. By the way, the idea of, is it possible the whole family obeys? Stan makes the point that the jailer's family obeyed. Stan, I was thinking of Cornelius when it says his whole household obeyed as well. So there is a great sense of that idea and how that can speak out to us. That being said, this brings us to the end. This brings us to the sense of how it is that we've laid out these characteristics. And so we've covered a lot of things here. By the way, Lamar's got a comment. He says, in the secular world, somebody could be a novice, but have a bachelor's degree or master's degree, but never have worked in that field until graduation. In fact, Lamar, isn't that usually the case? That's an interesting point. How often that is true. That's more often the case than not. So, that's a really interesting point to say that it is like that in the world as well. So next week, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be picking up and talking about deacons. And I think that a lot of times we focus a lot on the qualifications of overseers, but maybe not enough on how important the work of being a deacon is. I want to talk to you about these things and consider why this is such an important spiritual work. I want to make the case that it's, sometimes we kind of relegate the idea, well, the deacons just take care of the mundane or day-to-day things, and I don't think that's true at all. I think one of the most important works of the deacon is that the deacons are charged to be the peacemakers of the congregation. I'll explain to you where I get that idea from 1 Timothy chapter 3, some of the points that we see there, why it's such a spiritual and important work. I'll try to email you out a link to some of the information we have on that. You can actually find that information on our website under our FAQ on what are the qualifications of elders, what are the qualifications of deacons. We have a handout on that I'll send you a link to. But for now, great study. Appreciate all the comments that people have had and made and give us a great sense of understanding some ideas that can be difficult. As we consider these things, what we want to understand is that that this is an important thing for all of us to consider. All of us are aspiring to accomplish or to be or to achieve these characteristics. Even if we're not going to be an overseer in the church, all of us are trying our best to fulfill these things. Every one of these qualifications are things we're all striving for, and that's an important point for us to consider. So as we wrap up here and finish our thoughts, I want to thank everybody. We had some great comments and thoughts. Last comment, I missed one from Debbie. She makes the statement to say, in regards to the Galatians and their rather recent appointment, she also says, hey, they also had the guidance of the inspired apostles. So that does make a tremendous difference, doesn't it? So we thank you all for your thoughts and all the good comments we had. We'll talk to you, Lord willing, we'll be moving forward here soon. God bless. Have a great week.